Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Talks program. My name is Gail Bosch, and I work for I2 Art Insure. We specialize in the insurance of artworks and other collectibles, and we are proud sponsors of the Talks program this year. I'd like to invite you to enter our competition for our bespoke gin. And also, if you are purchasing works at the fair this weekend and you need insurance cover to get it home, scan our code here and it'll be instant once-off transit cover and 30 days in order to give you time to put it onto your policy. In our gift bags, we've got, it looks like a business card, but it's not. It's an RFID card. So if you keep that next to your bank card, it stops other people from tapping and accessing your account without you knowing. Other than that, welcome to the panelists. Welcome to everyone. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Sean O'Toole. I am a journalist, an art critic, lately a curator, wearing that hat. Today I'm doing a little bit of moderation. So I'm going to introduce everyone here. I know it's horrible when one goes to events and someone, typically the moderator, then reads very patiently and what is written online. I'm not going to do that. I will use first names mostly, but I'll do formal introductions to start. I think there's two co-moderators. The other is Olivia Barrell on my far left, an art historian, an entrepreneur, an art entrepreneur. Started art forms and published the book, which is available at the fair with the extraordinary exhibition of works in clay. It is extraordinary. It's well worth seeing. It's a real treat to see work like that, given that kind of public here and emphasis. Next to me, Andile Dyalvane. That is enough to introduce him for those who know him. It's Andile, the figurehead, the master with his hands, clay. The genius with clay. I had the privilege last year of being in Chicago and attending an exhibition that Andile did on the south side of Chicago, which, if you know the politics or the geography of Chicago, is as spatially messed up as Cape Town. The south side represents a very different demographic. Andile put on a remarkable show. It was partly mark-making, really not object-based. It was Andile, the body, the energy arriving in Chicago and reverberating in a room, singing, dancing, sharing his story of, and I hope we'll touch on that a little later, taking your forms back to your ancestors and what happened there. It was remarkable. And to see a very different public responding to this dynamic energy that is Andile. Okay, you won't find that on Wikipedia, I assure you. Seated next to him is Kamyar Bineshtarigh. Kamyar, for those of you who are local, we all know Kamyar. We've seen him at openings. The wonderful thing of being an artist emerging is how you move from the periphery, the shadows, into the center and command everyone's view. It began to happen over the last 2 years, the extraordinary exhibition at Norval, and then that solo show that you put on at Southern Guild, 9 Hopkins, which was a reflection on a studio that doesn't exist. If you go to that studio that it referenced, there's just earth-moving equipment there. It was also a meditation on process, and we'll talk a bit about that. Those of you who have been watching Kamyar for a longer time would know him. Oh, that's the guy who did that stuff on the wall at AVA. That isn't there anymore. Extraordinary. For me, what's been amazing to see is an artist gaining their voice. When you meet young artists, they tend to whisper to you. They're sometimes apologetic. I am in awe having conversations with Kamyar. There's a confidence and a certainty. And that's remarkable and must be commended. And I hope we can sort of tap into the life force, the certainty here today. Olivia, do you want to maybe give a little bit of a sense of what we're going to be chatting about today?
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the intro. I think what's very interesting about these two artists, Kamyar and Andile, who work in completely different mediums. So Andile Dyalvane works with clay, works with earth, works with 3-dimension, and Kamyar's recent work, we were talking about it earlier, is printing ink on canvas, 2-dimensional work. Yet there are a lot of themes that overlap between these two artists. And the two major themes that Sean and I were talking about when we were putting this talk together and brainstorming was the notion of migration and language. And I think what's so interesting is that both of the artists approach these themes in completely different ways. Andile Dyalvane has been obsessed with mark making since the very beginning of your practice with clay. I know Andile's practice very well because he's one of the longer chapters in my book, Clay Forms, which came out at the end of last year. And we've had a lot of opportunity and many hours talking about Andile's practice right from the beginning. But I think what's interesting, just to summarize it for the public, is that when Andile started working with clay, and really I think about your early, sort of your 2017, 2018, 2019 bodies of work. It was the imprint of the earth itself. So Andile Dyalvane did a residency at Bernard Leach in the UK, and a very beautiful body of work emerged from that. And you have these clay vessels and these sculptures that really capture the mud and the earth and the river washing the earth of that British landscape. Fast forward a few years' time, I was very excited about your recent work from last year when you started to work with symbols. So the mark making had grown into a language of its own. And Andile Dyalvane worked on a very beautiful body of work, which was symbols. There's a deep cosmological symbolic aspect to Dyalvane's practice. He works in communion and in language and in relationship to his ancestors. And during COVID, started to get these series of visions of these symbols that meant something to him, and he translated them into 3-dimensional sculptural form. And Andile, maybe you could tell us about your beautiful tablets that are on display at the moment at the Southern Guild booth at the art fair, which I think really is a culmination of these symbols that you really started during COVID, but that have become almost an alphabet imprinted into the earth. Maybe you can tell us a bit about it.
Yes, good morning. Is it? Oh, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. It makes me feel like I don't have to say anything because you've said all. But I do want to start a little bit back, and I don't know how much time I have or we have, but I'm going to just respond to you right now about the tablets. This was part of an exhibition that was in Israel, like a year-long show, and curated by Kevin Murray, who's Australian. And he had seen the evolution and the development of Itongo, or the symbology, Uyalezo, that's what the symbols are called. And as he was curating this exhibition, he said, Andile, I think you will be better fitting in this section called New Tradition. And these works will be displayed or in amongst some of the ancient tablets that are within this museum, which is something very, very, I found that was very powerful and sort of like affirming for me, because if I think about what Uyales, or the symbology that I've been envisioning and trying to channel, I consider it as the messages from the past. And so I would say these are the ulwimi labaphansi, the language from my ancestors. So my ancestors are from the Eastern Cape, and we have spoken, and we speak isiXhosa, that's our language. But before that, there were like other languages through sound, through movement, through, like activities and rituals within the landscape, within the community. And so I'm going back to this as saying that why I decided on the tablet. Some of the first writings that we trace, when you trace the human interactive and information that they've left with us, is clay tablets. And so for me, because I work with clay already, so it's so fitting that these sort of like calligraphy symbols, translate them into clay. And that's where then the cross-pollination from one medium and to the other. And so, and this is still the beginning of that. But I just want to quickly go back again, just slightly. There's another collection I created, was called Idladla. And this again was something that had to do with language and preserving it and bringing it back as well, because it had to do with us coming from the Eastern Cape and moving into the city and losing some of the practices that have and allow us to have the vocabulary that we no longer, now we are losing because we are not practicing some of these things. So I see that there's a lot of links to my practice that really speak of language, migration from different mediums, but or literal migration and displacement as well. So I think I'm going to pause a little bit there. Maybe that gives an insight. Yeah.
So that's beautiful. I love what you said about new tradition, and I love that you said that about the ancientness that exists in your work. And just to explain it to the audience, but Andile's very first sort of transliteration of the symbols was that he would sketch the symbols that he saw in his visions, and that would translate into a three-dimensional form. And the symbol was often stamped at the bottom of the form and has become slowly its own alphabet. And Kamyar, maybe that's an interesting introduction to jump in there. What is some of the ancientness that exists in your work?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming through, and thanks for the interaction. The ancientness of my work.
I can give you a prompt, maybe for those who didn't see the AVA work, because it's directly about language.
Yeah.
Maybe the title elaborates a bit on that.
Yes, I think going back from there, I mean, my initial interest in text is actually coming from a very personal and family perspective, because my dad here is a calligrapher. He does calligraphy. So I always had an interest in text as a form of art, which calligraphy is, and visuals. But then I became more interested into the politics of text and politics of language. There is obviously like the colonial aspects of that as well, and what language matters, what language matters less, or which I stumble upon Edward Said's writing, which is a Palestinian scholar and writer, and he, in his book Orientalism, in his essay, he explains about the perception of West towards the East, which is always demonized or exoticized. So I used that text, which was originally written in English, and my interest was actually the text itself as the forms, as the writings, which Arabic or Farsi writings using the same Arabic alphabets. I was trying to figure out that perception, that colonial narrative of visual would be in text itself as well. So what if you see an Arabic writing, for example, would those preperceptions about the East would come to the mind? So what I did in that body of work, I actually started writing the English where Edward Said wrote it originally in English. I started transliterating every word of the book into Arabic letters. So it would, because Arabic letters is phonetic text, so you can write any language using Arabic letters. So I transliterated this book that is talking about how West perceives East, perceives the Arabs, or but the the visual you see, it's almost like you can't read because it's a language that is supposed to be written in another letter. And so that gives the immediate perception of like, what am I looking at, what language it is, or what text it is, which always usually goes back to being a religious text. When it was at the AVA, I remember getting like a lot of people coming to me that's asking, oh, is this the mosque that you're painting? Yeah, so many silly things, like mostly that would actually completely be reflective of what Edward Said is actually saying in the book about how, also he's explaining about how language influences the colonial narrative. It wasn't just about the colonialism that was force, physical force, but also was literal force, literary literature. There was all those colonial myth that would be created through storytelling, through that would actually completely misrepresent a whole group of people. So that was if I would say that's probably my ancient part of the work.
I have a question to both of you. So it comes off a studio visit that I did with Kamyar, and one of the things you told me was the first thing is the material. Everything else is secondary. And then you added, my expansion as a painter grew from that, from the material. So I'm going to ask Andile first. Is the first thing for you the material, or is it the vision?
Thank you. Well, I would say it's the vision, but then at the same time, I could say it's the material as well. This is because it depending on what that material, when I'm working with or I'm interacting with, what is leading me to. But at most, the way that it works is that it's the vision, but the importance is to create an atmosphere that allows you to trigger these visions. And then from there, this is when then you, as you're creating the atmosphere, then you can start envisioning what this body of work or what this offering it will do for us. And then once that happens, then the material comes to life. And the minute one interacts with the material, it expands and one tends to move and allow the material to guide them, but at the same time control to try to channel what it is that the material is telling us as well, including the vision.
And couldn't you, just to jump in there, couldn't you argue that the material is the language? So for both of you, the material is your language.
Totally.
And I think...
Yeah, I think so. I mean, with the vision, I mean, definitely there is a vision, but I think the vision is more of a lie to me, because every time I have a vision, the result is different from that vision. So that's why I'm saying material is actually more of a guiding material that actually the vision almost goes away with it.
I like that because I think that's why I'm drawn to you or to your work as well, and somewhat we find ourselves, look at us now. I mean, if we were not having a glass of beer, it would be then this. Seriously. And but what I like about it is that like how we both use the material or how we sort of like our processes differ, but they yet crossing over as well. Because for me, I really sort of like the vision is the thing. It's what guides. And then, yes, the material, then it's the interaction, it's a push and pull, which at the end of the day, you can trace exactly where and how all of these are cross-pollinating as well. And for me, just as well, they're very important. And I would, this is for me, in any case, I wouldn't say it's a lie for me because if it is, if it's different from there, but you can see it may have given birth to this one, or if this one become this, but you can see that, you know, like he would say, pay homage to the other side as well. And then yet, how we interact and how we read what we see there, it may not be of identifying what are these symbols, what are these feelings or reactions that we have, but each side will both evoke the same kind of emotion.
And I think it's very interesting, this notion of language, because for each artist, and in the book that I recently published, Clay Forms, there were 30 artists in the book, all working with the same medium. Yet there were 30 separate languages. So each artist, and I think we're very drawn to artists with very defined, elaborate, sophisticated languages. because, you know, we're very drawn to that. And working with clay specifically, I noticed how many different languages there were. And I think what's very interesting also about both of you as artists is that a lot of your themes are also around language. And we talked about that mistranslation as such, the gap that exists between the vision and the actual artwork, or the gap that happens between the Eastern Cape and coming to the city. And I find that gap very interesting, and I think both of your works draw on what translation means. And I know, Kamyar, this is something you work a lot with, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you find interesting about translation, transliteration, and where you find that fascination in a lot of the languages and texts you work with.
Yes, I think, yeah, I'm touching on that, like what's my work, especially the works that's working directly with language, is a straddle between language and abstraction. And a lot of time translation and sometimes transliteration come into place, because like with Edward Said, I had to transliterate the words because they were written in English in Roman character. So to change that to Arabic letter, you transliterate it. But later on, I worked with, I think it was a different angle. But later on, I worked with actually Arabic Afrikaans, which I did a body of work on that. And a lot of people were like, oh, so this is the translation of Afrikaans into Arabic. And it was really difficult to explain, no, it's not, because it was actually the first written Afrikaans text was in Arabic letters. The documents that we have today that we found that people that were actually enslaved people that were from Southeast Asia, and Afrikaans at the time wasn't even a language that was officially accepted. They were called it like kitchen Dutch. It wasn't, you know, the language. Yes, yeah. And it wasn't accepted by, especially the Dutch, which later on they claimed it. At the time, which was the language that was basically created because the slaves were wanted to communicate with the masters, and it was created. So the only text that some of these slaves that came from Southeast Asia, and not only slaves, they were also immigrants, they were also exiled here, was they knew how to write in Arabic letters. And they started writing Afrikaans using Arabic letters, and they initiated madrasa in Cape Town. So in that sense, the translation, the line between translation and transliteration becomes very blurred, because also when you have access to only Roman character, it is really difficult, I think, to understand the phonetic side of other texts, like Arabic letters. So yeah, I mean, I worked around that, but also in a more painterly, gestural forms that also, again, makes it more abstract. It translates it in another language, as you mentioned, like playing with materials, you know, like for me, the base is that there is this vision, there is this narrative that I want to talk about, but the objects that I create is always also another conversation that I have with the material itself.
Well, can anything actually ever be translated? And what's lost in that translation? So even from the creation of the artist into the artwork, and Sean and I are on the other end where we write about the artwork. And there's something in that gap between the words and the artwork itself that is something that we have to dance with. Maybe, Sean, you could say you've been writing longer than me, how you approach or work with that gap.
I suppose it's about paying attention, and I think the cliche of art writing is sharing an opinion, good or bad, but often very rich description of the thing in front of you that you are communicating to a reader is the objective. The choice of nouns, adjectives, rich description. It's often sort of poo-pooed because we all like to read snarky stuff. Or praises, but you know that does close the gap of translation, but not entirely. Can I shift just take a very different question. For the audience here, we all know each other, so we haven't awkwardly been sandwiched together. Olivia and I cycle together. I've seen the gestation of the book, known the difficulties. These two gentlemen aren't only represented by the same gallery, they're chommies from Salt River. And it's important to recognize that because there's a public-facing side to the art world, and then there's this mercurial stuff that happens behind the scenes. And we use words like collaboration and associations, but what happens when you work in clay, you work in glue? You know, I'm being needlessly provocative, but you know what I mean. There's conversations that happen. How do they inform what eventually arrives at the Cape Town Art Fair? When does that conversation get lost? When is it still with you? Maybe that might sound like a difficult question. So how did you first meet and then run?
You go for it.
Shall I?
I know. I mean, like I know when we had proper interaction. So maybe you start.
I actually don't remember, but I do remember sharing a beer together. That's for sure. And the reason being is that my studio is probably like 1 minute walk when Kamyar's studio was. But then there's a water hole right next to me, which is a beer hole. A good friend who has a craft beer, and literally, so this is what happens, is that we share that pint, and then within the sharing of the pint, then there's conversation that's happening and studio visit. And then you're like, wow, this is amazing. Oh, when have you been here? And of course, I've seen your work, but then we start seeing that there's sort of like similarities or interest, not only the beer or the water hole that we have to go to, but then the work itself and the commonality of our practice. And then from there, this is where it starts, where you will never know, as you see the work of both of us is evolving, that eventually you're going to find that we're going to be speaking or crossing over like the same language, or perhaps speaking the same language as well. So I'm curious to see where this relationship is going to take us, because we keep saying, I mean, I even, when I went to Asia once, I brought a calligraphy brush, and then, because seeing what you do, and I've met your father, and I was like, this is a master, I would really love to interact with him and learn, from the master. But at the same time, I'm like, well, let's see what's going to happen. Then the next beer come, and then we keep sitting in the circle and everything. But that's how it starts. And for me, that's what the collaboration happens. That's what the interaction and creating a community of different people in one space to try to speak one language that doesn't discriminate in the sense, because creativity and art and expression for us, at least for me, that's what we see.
And just to jump in there, I think that's very interesting, maybe for the audience to hear. Maybe you can start coming up. What did you identify with in Andile's work?
I think before that, with Andile's work, I very much identified with the space and his openness. That is always such a fantastic thing. I think the first time I ever actually came to your studio is a very interesting story. I was just arrived to the studio in the morning, and then I had another studio mate, Patrick Bongoy, I don't know if you know the artist. And he came to me, he was like, there is a ceremony at Andile's place, let's go. I was like, okay, let's go. And I was like, okay, Andile, yes, let me go, let's see what's happening there. And I just had ordered sushi. So I arrived there, and I see this setting of like, I think there were like a lot of people that day that they're sitting in around the circle with pepe burning, and then the beer going around. And I literally sat right in the middle somewhere there was no way I could escape it. And I just sat there, and it felt so great. And I just kept drinking, and I never got my sushi. That was the first interaction. I kept going back every time I was there. He would now come to the studio as well. We drink together, or we go to the beer brewery. So there are lots of these conversations that actually was first before actually either of us interacting with the work. And so I think our friendship allowed us to get closer to each other's works as well, which has been amazing. I mean, I was not much in clay world, you know. I made one clay sculpture at one point.
But it's not necessarily the medium that you would identify with. And for those who don't know, Andile Dyalvane's got a very beautiful studio in Woodstock called Emiso, which has a very special atmosphere. There's always people there. It has like communal atmosphere. There's always the smell of burning incense. And it actually represents so much of how Andile's process works. So Andile's process of making is almost dream state, trance state. And I was very privileged to witness at the end of last year you building one of your large-scale sculptures. And Andile puts on very loud music, and he enters into a sort of a trance state, and he works the clay, which is it's a monumental piece of clay, and he beats on it with his hands like a drum in like a state, and the piece starts to collapse in on itself. So it's the building of a beautiful form and then sort of the caving in, and he allows the clay to sort of move into itself. So it's a very unusual way of working, which is what makes Andile's practice very beautiful and unusual. And so just to explain to the audience why I'm sure you were drawn to the studio.
Yeah. There's one thing I just wanted to say about your work and how just how I've seen it first, and how when I saw the exhibition at the Nobel Foundation, it was such a beautiful, because when you explained to me, this is about really the material sometimes leading you to new discovery in the direction of work, which when you allow that to happen, those sort of like serendipitous or accidental moments. So, and for me, that's where I play in, because it's the vision, the material itself guiding you, or yourself allowing to flow with it as well, depending on what materials are we using and where they're going to lead you, how they interact, or how they interact with each other and yourself as well, which you become a material. And from there, again, let's put it this way, a new language is born, and it gets crossed over with a different medium, in this case, from the ink to the glue, which is quite fascinating. And now to be able to translate these objects and bring them and then bring a new life, as much as initially it would have been transcribed on canvas or on paper, but now like it takes a different form, and then we say, oh, Kamyar, he invented this, he's a glue guy. So, but I love, so I love that, and for me it's, so when that happened, I was like, yes, so you're not rigid in that sense, you are fluid, and this is me, so I can blow, we can move in this sense, so it's a dance. So, and for me, that's what I look at when I'm interacting with someone, be it a sound, I've got Ucebo here, so with movement as well, that influence what we do, and these are some of the languages that we use in informing what we do, from sound to movement to everything, basically. And so I just wanted to touch on that and say, I really, really like that happened there.
And Kamyar, maybe I haven't seen you work, but I imagine just seeing your recent work that you have a similar interaction with ink.
I think, yes, I do have definitely similar interaction with ink, which is different every time as well. Like, I do have interaction with ink, but it's not same every time. Like the works that I do on the wall, I mean, also it's amazing for me, like the people that are close to me that come to the studio, especially if your studio is close to me, they have a very different perception towards my wall works, especially, because I think at every stage they've seen my walls being walls, and not just this object hung in a white cube of a gallery. So I know all of every person that, like Andile, has seen, like, comes to the exhibition and knows that this piece is that wall that was back there. And the interaction with ink, yes, I would say it's different, but I love the materiality of ink, especially printing ink, because it's very thick and the color is so rich and almost shiny as well, and you can also dilute it with terps, and you get, every time, depending on how much you dilute it, you get a different color. The same color can become like so many different colors.
So can you maybe just continue with that? There's the big work at your solo booth, Intifada, which is on the outside, the big black ink work. Is it painted horizontally? What are the mechanics of making such a big work?
Actually, that work, everyone thinks that's a new direction that I'm going, but actually I made those works, I started making those works a few years ago. It was like 2017 or 18 that I made first of that series. But they were much smaller. This was the biggest I went with this series. And how I start is from the top. I start with very small marks.
So vertically.
I go
But is it mounted on a wall?
No, it's actually on a stretched canvas. So it's not that those pieces are done. This was like initially an empty canvas that I did. So I start making very tiny marks. I go from one side to the other, and I come to the second row. That the first part takes me really long because it has to be very tiny, and then eventually it gets larger and larger. So I keep changing my stick. At first I start using like a stick because it's just basically a dot. And then it becomes brushes, and then I go from one size. After I finish, change it to the next size, and until it comes to the bottom and it becomes like a very thick brush stroke. And eventually it will create this like mass crowd kind of thing, but at the end of the day it's just an abstract piece. But the readings that I was getting from that was very interesting, actually, that everyone would see a different thing. Some people would see it as somebody told me it looks like a penguins huddling in Antarctica when they get cold. So they all gather in one place to warm each other. And someone said it looks like pilgrims attending Hajj. So, and that actually led me towards the titling of the work and towards making a video piece that I juxtaposed the Hajj, that people were attending Hajj, and on the other side actually showed the footage of penguin colony huddling in the coldest time of the year. So the titles at the time, I titled the painting as Pilgrims, because I was influenced by that narrative of like, but also the whole idea of like everyone from around the world gathering in one place, migration and being in one place. And then when I finished this painting, actually during the painting, because it took me quite a few months to do this painting, and everything happened in the world, and I felt the urgency to change the title now. And I was like quite intentional, what would that confront? What would that say? Where do I stand? How do I keep that stance? And it's been an interesting interactions that a lot of people have. They see the work, they're like, oh wow, this is immersive, this is amazing. And then they go close to the title, and some of them get offended, some people get offended, and some people get even more of a, which goes back to the idea of language and misrepresentation of language, because the word intifada itself is an Arabic word that basically means to shake off, and it obviously refers to the uprising, but for some people it has a completely different narrative. So that for me was also really important in that work, but the piece itself is just an abstract piece.
And so its original title was Pilgrims.
Pilgrims, yes.
And I think it's interesting, I mean, just personally, there's something about the work that evokes the mechanics of writing, the movements of your process. So I found that original title very interesting, like the recording of early scripture, the relationship to pilgrims and to language and to recording. And I think I loved what you were saying about the ink, because of course you come from a family of calligraphy, and part of it is the brushstroke and the mark making, but the other is probably this relationship to the medium that is ink, which is so interesting.
Absolutely. I think there's something very calligraphical about it. Actually, yesterday there was this other Iranian that saw my work. She wasn't Iranian, but she lived in Iran, and she said that my dad collects a lot of Iranian art. And she said as soon as I saw the work, I knew it was an Iranian artist. And I was like, why and how? Because these are just brush strokes. But I realized there is that calligraphical element into it that might be certain identification, that I wouldn't be even aware of that. But some people that are more familiar with the visual from other artists as well could read through it. Yeah.
And is that not perhaps inherited tradition in the same way that Andile's been working with earth in the Eastern Cape since you were a small child? So it's like that inherited tradition of mark making that's now become new tradition in your new works.
I would agree with that because in my case, again, there's something about, you know, a new tradition, but at the same time, we talk about migration and displacement and all those things. Because when I pay homage to the collection that you were speaking about, the one that collapsible, is that it was really paying homage to the time in the village where I would play with clay in the rivers and the tongas as well, in the crevices. And this is the time where I think that it was all these messages or my becoming was being whispered by the spirit of the ancestor who lived within, you know, the very bottom of where they are amongst the earth beings from back in time. So why I'm mentioning that is because it's been like 45 years now, and in my village or in my surrounding, I've never interacted with anyone or I identify or anyone who has worked with clay to make the objects, because when I was born, this is the time where the displacement and the objects were removed. So why I'm mentioning this as well is that why the messages or the language is coming back is to bring back what that ancient language, which has to do with the inheritance and the DNA and the duties that we need to do, or recover these ancient language that are not Latin or any other way, because again, you cannot identify these symbologies that I'm creating because they're based on the visual and the gestures of the brush. So it's only if I'm explaining it to you that you're going to understand what that means, because that's how deep and embedded in my DNA, if you may.
I think earlier I asked you about ancientness, but what it really is sort of this ancient traditions that almost run unconsciously, I think, in the mark making that have become apparent in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think at any point I had an intention of, or trying to make works that is ancient or identifying with my culture or politics, or everything just naturally a lot of time comes, and consciously at the same time. Because like when it's a lot of times also I think artist integrity is a very important thing for me, that like I don't say yes to everything that comes to my mind. I'm selective about them. With the material, yes, because I don't think material can be problematic. But with the narrative, with that, I'm very conscious of the steps I'm taking, and at no point I would want to almost abuse identity politicking, and so those time, and at the same time I do not want to refuse if it's naturally there. So yeah.
I have a question. It relates to being in the studio and making, and then oops, the oops moment. That's the worst way of framing it. But you've both had that kind of event that's been hugely, hugely influential. I think it was when you were on the Bernard Leach residency. You had attached or nailed large canvases and were experimenting with glue. So maybe just, we've spoken a lot about Kamyar's calligraphic mark, but if you go to his solo booth, you'll also see the works that are made with glue and ink, and some of them are kind of relief pulls, if you want to call them that. They are made collaboratively with your father, but it emerged out of an accident. It wasn't intention that led you there. So who wants to go first on accident?
I'm going to go first,
okay,
so that then he can feel.
Tell about that thing that broke. There's no way back.
No, there's no way back there, but again, there's something there. But I'm going to go back to the piece. Yeah, this one. Yeah, we've shared, we've cried, and we had a beer because the piece broke. That's why. But thank you for this, because there's something I would mention about being in a space that you're unfamiliar with. Again, So I sometimes migrate myself away from my studio to do a residency somewhere else in order for me to be able to be uncomfortable. Or perhaps I'm guided to go to these places so I can get more information about what I may have lost as well. So why I'm mentioning this again is that when I was working in the studio, this particular piece that gave birth to these collapsible pieces we call umonyo. The sound already sounds wonyo. That's what clay sound looks like. But it's literally, it's a crevice. And so when I was working in the studio, and so I worked on 2, 3, 4 pieces at a time, and this is at the old Bernard Leach studio, which is a very old wooden floor and sort of like bouncing. So I got my music going, and I'm moving and dancing around these pieces, and I'm trying to really control this form because I literally drew it. I wanted to get to this scale and to this form that is
But
almost
just to
like
give
dancing.
context, this is in southern England.
This is in St. Ives, in Cornwall, to be specific. And so I was doing this 3 months residency there. And so in my process, interacting with this ancient clay from there, also interacting with the glazes and the environment and atmosphere. So what then happened is that as I'm busy moving and dancing with these pieces, and then I hear this plop sound, right? And so, and there tend to be people walking around and watch me when I'm working in such a space. So they were there and they saw it, and they're like, and because they could see, like, I've reached a certain scale, and it's really, like, impressive as they would see. And I look back, I was like, wow, this is amazing! They're like, are you mad? I'm like, you have no idea. This clay is dancing with me, right? So that's what happens. So for me, it's like, that was, out of all the pieces that were there, that was the most powerful and one of my favorite pieces. Because then I'll continue with other pieces, and gravity plays its role, and it kept on pulling and cracking and doing. And remember, the subject I was exploring had to do with the crevices and everything. So naturally, that was what's happening. And for me, that led to the dance and allowing the material to give birth to a body of work and a new language.
And just to jump in there, Sean, I mean, you could say accident or you could say control. But aren't these both artists that work outside of the bounds of control? We can sort of feel that in the works, and maybe that's what makes them strong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with control, I don't, a lot of times I really don't have control over the work. I think the Intifada piece is quite controlled, but there is also elements of but with other works, the accident has been, I think, but the birth of the Intifada was an accident. How I got there was an accident. But the most amazing accident that happened, which shifted my practice quite drastically, was the glue, as you mentioned. I was working on other pieces, working on those pieces that was Arabic Afrikaans, and how I usually work for 2 years, I had this one studio, quite small. I had one wall, that's all the works was made on that specific wall. And how I worked was I would nail pieces of canvas, material, fabric, onto the wall and start painting and writing, painting with ink onto this fabric. And all this would seep through and make these marks on the back of the fabric when you take it off. So for 2 years there was marks, layers of marks that I made in the studio, making other pieces. And a lot of times I would have visitors and they would come and write notes on my wall. And at some point I made it like a tradition. Whoever came, I would say, just write something on my wall too. And so there was layers of that. And then at some point I started using cold glue because I was experimenting with how to make the fabric sculptural, and somebody says, use cold glue, just dip it in cold glue or brush cold glue on it and you can just shape it and it will keep that shape. So I applied cold glue on the wall when the fabric was on fabric, and the day after I came, there were drips of the glue on the wall, and I tried to pick the work off, and I saw this glue just came off, but not only the glue, it literally pulled the print of the wall itself, the first layer of the wall, and all these marks came off with it. But at the time, it was just small patches, small sections of the glue, because I didn't. And then I was like, wait a minute. If I apply this glue on the entire wall, the whole thing will come off as a piece, as one piece.
Imprint.
Yeah, imprint, exactly. And I started, and I didn't know how much glue, because the one layer of glue would be like not enough. And I started applying a glue today, and then another one. Like I used, like for that first piece, I think I used 50 liters of cold glue. And then at that, there was a moment that I was like, okay, let's, it was with my dad, that my dad came and we were like trying to, and then as we started, it just literally, the whole thing was coming off all together. There were some holes on the wall, maybe like was like tearing, but then also that looked amazing. So I just kept going, and then when the whole thing came off, I was like, oh my God, my wall is on the floor now, because we placed it on the floor. So that was one of my most, and then after that, obviously, it inspired me to do so much more with that technique.
And we're almost going to open it up just in a few minutes. Liv, can I sneak in? That's a very easy question. It directly responds here. You've mentioned your father. Your father's seated here. He's a collaborator, but also a critic, I would argue. Andile made a documentary of taking some of his big clay pieces back to your village and presenting them to your family. What is it like working with family as collaborator? I mean, what energy does it give to your work and your practice?
Well, yeah, that's it. For me, I think the very first one that I've done was to bring the clay pot as a gift to my father, which basically led me to realize what it is and the purpose of why I do what I do, because it basically was bringing this ancient or lost artifact that is very communal. So when you do that, when you see the emotion of your father, how proud they become, or how your family becomes so proud, or basically recall a memory that they've suppressed, so it makes you really wonder, or perhaps it affirms you that you are a member of this community, of this family, that is contributing to the growth and the prosperity of that family. So, and that's what a father or a community would wish for when they're grooming you. And for me, when they affirmed it, said, you are the one who's going to bring back dignity or remind us who we are because of these objects and artifacts that you're bringing back, or this language that you're bringing back. So that was, then that informed then this big migration of these tools to the Eastern Cape.
Yeah, I think with my dad, my collaboration has been absolutely amazing. Like, one thing is his calligraphy, that I actually believe that he thinks my calligraphy is shit. Sorry for my language, because I didn't continue practicing much as he did, or he wanted me to do, at least. So that's why I think I went towards using language rather than calligraphy, because I was lazy. But the collaboration has been not only for calligraphy, but also like every time I'm having an exhibition, he's like literally there to support like every single part. He knows what to do. Like, I think like if I'm not an artist anymore, he can continue doing my work and it would look exactly the same. And a lot of times it's also like he say things that I later on think about. I was like, that would actually work so well. Let's try that. But he's also a big critic of mine, like with the text itself, that sometimes he finds like a letter and he says like, that letter was actually good. This H, you did it so well. The rest, I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to be the roving mic. So,
I'd like to hear from each of you, what 3 problems are you looking for solutions for?
What 3 problems they have that they're looking for solutions for in terms of their work? Or in anything in life? Open book.
For me is to, I don't know, I really have to think about this question, but I just usually make the work, and then what the work informs me, it may be the statement that may be solving or unearthing, like solving a problem. And so I'm only here and being present to channel and hopefully what I am intentioning, which has to do with seeing each other, or that has to do with including each other or cross-pollinating and collaborating. So that may be the problem of not being individualistic about us, but being communal in everything that we do as we work together, perhaps. I hope that answers you.
For me, the first one, which is, I mean, like there's a personal ones that are not really important, but one of them is that I really need to find a new studio in this month. One thing, I think I should have around 200 above. I work big and yeah, because my studio got demolished, so that's why I had a massive space. And
A studio that's provided by a patron or a rental?
Rental, possibly. Either, actually. If anybody has a space,
Anyone with
please,
ideas,
please.
come on after the talk.
And second one is I need to get my South African visa. Home Affairs has been a mess. I've been here 13 years and I still don't have one. But these two are personal and not that important. The third one would be for the world mostly, and that's for a free Palestine.
We've got one more question in the back, yes.
Yes, good morning. My name is Karina, and my question is for, I don't know, everyone in the panel, and maybe people here, if you can meet me outside. This is something I really struggle with. I just recently started working with clay, also with ceramics. And in terms of speaking of language, I think I found my artistic language, but what I struggle with is translating that and making sure that I stay true to my language and what I want to say. So I wanted to know, you have had these long careers. What is it, or I don't know, how do you make sure that you're creating for yourself, for your inner voice, for whatever it is that feeds you, and not creating for capital or for trends, or I don't know, how do you stay true to your language and your initial thoughts? Thank you.
Can I just jump in there for a second, having worked with a lot of artists who were expressing themselves through a medium. And I wrote in the introduction to the book that all of the artists, the large majority of artists in the book, had been working with the material for some of them many decades. You know, Andile, and there's another ceramic artist, Catherine Glende, in the audience today. These are artists that have spent decades working with a material. And often it requires a long time to master a material before you can find your voice and stay true to it. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yes, Kathy, yeah.
And the material mastering you.
That's very true, because in my case as well, just to answer that as well, is that honesty and allowing yourself the material to guide you. So she's my mentor a long time ago, so I think I'm using these words in this sense, in saying that, you know, like the material really guides you. So all you need to do is to be true to that material and being honest to it. In that way, you're going to be honest to yourself and let the narrative be driven and guided by the material. You don't have to explain yourself, but just allow yourself to move with it. And eventually, you will find your voice, and we'll be able to trace it, because we can see it was baby steps and baby talk, if you may, but we can start seeing you, your language and your signature as we go. That's all.
I think, I mean, like looking back at when I started making works, and the first presentations I would have and exhibition I would have was the most joyful moments, actually. There was a lot of doubt, but that doubt is the most important part. I feel like do not try to put a sticker to that doubt as a wrong thing. That doubt is actually the most important thing.
Okay, we're going to take one more.
I have a question for a young artist who is kind of struggling to also find their art style. Obviously, it takes trial and error when you're practicing, but do you have anything to say in terms of when you don't have like a vision, or when you can't, like when a vision doesn't come to you or like an idea doesn't come to you, but you have a deadline almost in your head and you need to get this done. So is there any advice on that art block?
You take that.
I don't know if they have art blocks, these two artists. Either of you struggle with that.
You go.
I think for me, art blocks are part of my works too. So don't think when you have art blocks, it's blocks. Just treat them as part of a bigger journey. That it can be amazing itself. Yeah. Just push through, and do not think it as a block. So try to, yeah.
And also, hi young lady. So that's my daughter. That's our daughter. So. So, but it's a beautiful question, and I like what you're saying, because every part of the process, that block is definitely a process for you to pause to see how far you can go into your brain or into your creativity or into your trying to see what it is that you want to create. So it is important to need to embrace that. So this is similarly to where we create pots or clay sculptures, taking a whole month. When they break accidentally, that's very sore, but there's some lessons to that. And so you can be more careful, or you can do it much better, or you can really be very upset and take a walk and come back in with a clear mind, perhaps. But it's a journey which you will live to tell, and people can tell stories through that like the process itself as well.
Exactly. I think also rest is important. Don't think also you can't just rest for a bit. We can't do that.
Yeah.
I think important, the two questions, the two last ones, I think, come from the same impulse. Doing precedes exhibiting. Exhibiting isn't the beginning.
Yeah.
And also objects move through time and space. This is merely a moment in the life, in a commercial fair. It's not their final destination. And think of its journey before, and those things that you're doing in the studio. Do rather than think about doing.
I agree with you on that way, because when you go, you go to the studio, but when you go to the studio, every object and element makes the work. It is the work. So just to echo again that what we're seeing as a final project, it's informed by so much. All the work has happened. I mentioned this also because when we took this object to the Eastern Cape, that packing them, putting them into the truck, 12-hour drive into a muddy road and unpacking them and have people interact with them, that meant that was the making of the work itself.
No, I was just going to say maybe, we could end on that note about the porousness of things and the porousness of work that begins somewhere. And I like that you said that, Sean, because a lot of artists, the ideas go so far back in time. They're so deeply embedded. They go back sometimes way past into the generations, into history. And they're embedded with so much in this porousness of the artwork that lives so long. And this just being a moment, like language, that is always in a state of growth. So thank you so much for what you both have said. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Sean.
An art fair isn't just buying and selling, it's networking. Hit them up outside. It's about speaking to people, having one-on-one dialogues that produce something else that you take from here. That's also what this opportunity is. You know who Andile is. He'd be hard to miss now. Kamyar the same. I want to thank all of you, and Olivia too, for those. It was Olivia's genius that sort of framed this conversation and gave it the thematics, that gave it the energy. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you.